Okay, this is going to be part two of the brainwashing in rail worker death investigation reports by the Transportation Safety Board and its rail picks, or rail partners in crime, as I like to call them. And since my videos build on one another, make sure you look at part one for brainwashing in railway investigation reports before you look at this video as part two. Now, you're going to see this particular section on all the brainwashing videos because I need to keep everybody reminded as to the different documentation that fits into all of this. On the left, the Railway Safety Act. Then we have CTC Rail 3 or SOR 87-150, which is the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And then the final document, TCO 0-102, the proposed new rules respecting minimum qualification standards for railway employees. So again, keep in mind, acts override regulations, regulations override rules, and all of these are used in, pulling information from one or the other, or excluding the act, for example, completely from Jason's accident reports, in order to give the proper effect that the Transportation Safety Board, Transport Canada, the rail carriers, whatever, want to give as they brainwash the public and all rail families, whether or not you are a frontline rail family, you are a investor as far as investing in rail carriers, whether or not you're a rail customer. There are many, many rail families that are impacted by all of these issues. And so, again, acts override regulations, regulations override rules, and then there's also guidelines, policies, whatever. Acts and regulations, definitely enforceable in court. The others may not be. So keep all that in mind as we continue to go through these brainwashing videos. Okay, if we look at page 11 of the Railway Investigation Report, which is the first document here on the left, there's several points I want to point out to you. First of all, it says here, for the qualifying trips. I need you to note the sentence structure here, because by putting that little phrase at the beginning, for the qualifying trips, that has a plural there, but there's also a singular, for the qualifying trips. There's only one qualifying trip, and I need people to understand that. If you look at the top page here, which I took from a TSB investigation report, R07T0270, that was table 1 on page 11 of that report, which was a report pertaining to a Mackyard incident in 2007, which really exposed the fact that there was fake qualification of rail workers, frontline rail workers going on. Anyways, in that report, they had provided a summary table of what the training program was like for CN Rail. And if you look here, you have the classroom instruction, observation trips, which was 2 weeks where they just ride along. They do nothing, they just ride along, the conductor trainees. Then they have classroom training from week 5 to 7. Belt pack training, whether or not they get that in week 8 to 9. My child, and I suspect a lot of frontline rail workers, do not get that training until much later. For my child, they had been qualified, I think, over a year before they had received that training. So this does not necessarily happen where they state here, at least not at this time. And then let's see, then you had the trial trips. What I want you to notice there, it doesn't say qualifying trips. These are trial trips. So they basically come out of class and then they go on what are called tours. And so there's supposed to be 45 of these, and I believe 15 of them are supposed to be in the yard and 30 on the line or outside of the yard. And so Those are trial trips. The only thing where the word qualification appears is at the very end here, where you have the qualification test. So in the regulation SOR 87-150, which is the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, it states that no rail carrier will allow an employee to work in an occupational category unless that employee has qualified. Has qualified means they've gone through this training program and they've taken the qualification test, the final test. So when CN here said, or when the TSB report on page 11, the first page here says, for the qualifying trips, I suspect there's a reason that they worded it this way. If you read the rest of the sentence, it says, CN has no written policies or guidelines in place that specify proximity requirements between the conductor and the trainee while they perform switching operations. I don't care what CN's guidelines or written policies are. All that matters is the law. That's all that matters. And the law says you're not allowed to place an employee in an occupational category unless that employee has qualified for that occupational category. And a trainee who's fresh out of training class would not have qualified for their occupational category. They have to go through all their trial trips in these weeks 10 to 14 supposedly. They have to go through all these trial trips, and then at the very end of the program they take the qualification test, which is why they would then have qualified. So the thing is, when they're saying here for the qualifying trips there's no proximity guidelines or requirements, that is a total lie in how they're saying this, because you're not allowed as a rail carrier to allow that employee to work alone if they haven't qualified in that category. And a trainee would not have qualified until they have taken their final test. So here's the issue. I have suspected for a very long time that conductor trainee Jason Clooney was being qualified the day he was killed. And there's a lot of issues with that if that was true, because he would not have completed the yard component of the training program. If you look here on the bottom section here, it says, this is a page I took from an on-the-job trainer interview. It's page 5 of 6 for a witness statement. And note it says best available copy. This thing was really hard to read, the copy that they gave me. And I got this through the access to information process. But I wanted to blow up where I have the last 2 arrows of that page. I blew it up for question 31 and the answer to question 31 for the on-the-job trainer. It says, with respect to Jason Clooney, to what extent had he received opportunities for training in both yard tours and road tours? Now note the answer from this OJT witness statement. It says, he only had opportunity to do road training, but he had exceeded the minimum amount of road tours and was ready for yard training. That means he had 0 yard training. So if indeed he was being qualified, as I suspected, or fake qualified, and again, I knew someone who worked in the area, in that northern part of Saskatchewan, where conductor trainee Jason Clooney had been killed. And this other person had been a conductor trainee also at the same time, around the same time as conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And this person had told me the word was that when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, he was being qualified for his qualification test that day. If that's true and he had 0 yard training, you know, when you put all these documents together, it paints a very nasty picture for CN Rail. And so it would make perfect sense that they would try and say for the qualifying trips. There are not trips. There is one qualifying trip, and that's where you take your final test. But by putting it this way, they can make it seem like all these trips are qualifying trips. They're not. They're trial trips. They are not all considered qualifying trips. Only the last one in the industry is considered the qualifying trip, the one that where you take your tests in order to get your actual qualifications for that occupational category. Now, the other point I need to bring to your attention here is the fact that this OJT, this on-the-job trainer interview, and I cover this in another video. This was an interview. This person is not the on-the-job trainer, as in the supervising conductor. Okay? The on-the-job trainer, if you note at the bottom here, again, on page 11 of the Transportation Safety Board report, it says an on-the-job trainer is an experienced employee who is designated by the company to provide assignments and trainers for the trainee. That is what I call a made-to-fit definition. You will not find this definition for an on-the-job trainer anywhere else, and in fact it contradicts the definitions that are provided in regulations pertaining to frontline railway employees. An on-the-job trainer per Transport Canada is a person who provides training to the trainee. So it is not this made-to-fit definition that they inserted here when they were writing this report to give us their story du jour, as I call it. And this on-the-job trainer witness statement was taken 214 days after conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, when the witness statements for the other 3 crew members were taken the day after he died. But we needed to give a, we needed to write this report and, give our story du jour to the public and to rail families. And so, in my opinion, they came up with this. Oh, we're going to use the on-the-job trainer, and then they use it as if that person is almost the same as the supervising conductor in order to confuse the reader and basically deceive the reader. So when you put all of these documents together, it's very incriminating for CN Rail, but also for the Transportation Safety Board and Transport Canada, because all of this was clearly written in this very specific manner for a very specific reason. So don't be deceived. Know when you're being deceived and know the tricks that they use. And that often requires doing a lot of digging and, really paying attention to detail. It means getting information you may not normally get by going through processes like access to information and, squinting to make out the documents that they give you when the copies are just pretty bad and very hard to read. But anyways, it's a lot of work, takes a lot of time, but when you get to put the pieces together, it does show a very nasty picture. And so that's what I wanted to show you here, this for the qualifying trips. If conductor trainee Jason Clooney was being qualified the day he was killed, all of this would be proof that CN Rail is qualifying conductor trainees before they have the proper training in the field, because Jason had 0 yard training. And again, table 1, page 11 from the R07T027E report, that was a report that showed way back in 2007 that conductor trainees and newly qualified, they weren't getting the training, the conductors, that they were supposed to be getting before they were qualified. And so we, can't be wondering why there's so many accidents and things are getting exponentially more dangerous in the rail industry. So very, very incriminating stuff for a lot of parties. And there's a reason these reports are written the way they are. Okay, so again, on page 11 of the Railway Investigation Report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, after the Transportation Safety Board gives us all of the bullet points of what the training program was supposed to be, and basically tells us that CN had no written policies or guidelines pertaining to proximity, when that's completely irrelevant because only the law matters, not CN's guidelines or rules or whatever. Anyways, so then note here the arrow that I have here on the right, where it says, once a conductor trainee completes the required number of qualifying trips, the evaluations are reviewed by the on-the-job trainer. Again, that is singular. And he's supposed to then, he or she then decides whether the trainee is qualified to work as a fully qualified conductor. So that is supposed to be the last step, that the on the job trainer, and again it's singular here, is supposed to review all the evaluations, and that would include the last qualifying trip where you're having that field test where, you know, it's basically the last step to determine whether or not you pass the field training and you're skilled in all the skills you're supposed to have as a qualified conductor. So that review needs to happen, and including for that last trip, and then the qualified trainer determines if you're qualified based on all the evaluations to work as a conductor. Now, the arrows on the left here show a Transportation Safety Board review of CN's present accelerated conductor training program revealed the following. Now, remember, we were told, according to the regulation, section 19, that CN only needs to file changes to their training program within 90 days after implementation, basically. That's not true because the Railway Safety Act, Section 19, overrides the regulation. And according to the Railway Safety Act, the changes to any training programs must first be filed with Transport Canada and approved by the Minister of Transportation before field implementation. So when they told us before this section, the regulations still apply, yeah, the regulations still apply, but so does the Act, and the Act overrides the regulation. So here now we're going to get into CN Rail's training program as it existed at the time of the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. So the initial 2 weeks of observation trips with a qualified conductor has been cut. Okay, was that approved by Transport Canada? And I can tell you, I asked for all the changes to the training programs via Freedom of Information request, and none were provided to me. And if you look at the Health and Safety Officer report, because he did a separate report that was about 80 pages long, he works for Transport Canada. And when that report was written, there was a comment in there that the information tied to training programs or changes appeared to be somewhat outdated. So looks like, you know, the rail carriers were very likely not following the Railway Safety Act and that they were implementing changes to training programs without proper review and approval by the Minister of Transportation at Transport Canada. So we have here the initial 2 weeks with a qualified conductor. Those have been cut. Didn't have that. Then recently qualified or less experienced conductors are permitted to train new hires. This one is absolutely huge. The training program was supposed to have an experienced conductor. Per that table, it was supposed to be an experienced conductor that was providing the training for conductor trainees. Well, when my child went through the conductor training program, and after that, there's like, after you pass your field test, there's supposed to be I think a 6-month probation period during which you're in the field doing the work, but you're still subject to dismissal as being unfit to be a conductor, according to the union. Okay? So, or the managers in the field, if they think that, okay, fine, you've gone through the training program, but you're just not getting it, so we're going to fire you. So when you're on probation yourself, subject to dismissal for being unfit, should you be training even younger, less experienced conductor trainees if you yourself are subject to dismissal for not being a properly qualified conductor, that this is not, you're just not getting it, and this is not the type of work for you? Um, so in the case of my child was asked to basically oversee when my child was on probation, and basically immediately after having taken that final test in the field, they were being asked to supervise other conductor trainees when they themselves are subject to dismissal on probation. And there was the case of one conductor trainee that was being overseen by my child. And the pressure is intense, even from other conductor trainees and newly qualified conductors, to qualify this next trainee. Because when you're a conductor trainee, you're making half the wage of a qualified conductor. Your salary basically doubles overnight when you're qualified. And so, these conductor trainees were in class together, they've worked together, they become chums. And so why wouldn't you want to help qualify your buddy to get them their increase in pay? And there was one person in particular that my child was getting a lot of pressure from coworkers to qualify this conductor trainee. And when my child said, I'm absolutely not qualifying this guy because he needs a lot more work. And there was a lot of pressure put on my child because they refused to qualify this even younger or less qualified trainee in the field. And again, my child would have been subject to dismissal because they were still on probation. So why in the world is CN allowing newly qualified conductors themselves still on probation to be training even less experienced conductor trainees? And when you're on probation, there may be a lot of stuff that you're still so new at that you may be still doing wrong and that you need to have changed. And so again, are you properly training an even less experienced conductor trainee if you yourself may still be doing stuff wrong? Are you passing on the bad knowledge to somebody who's even less experienced than you as a conductor trainee? It's just an absolutely huge issue. Now, the next bullet point here, some conductors who are providing on-the-job supervision are not completing the evaluation review sheets for trainees. So in this occurrence with conductor trainee Jason Clooney, the trainee had received 44 of 57 evaluations. So almost 25% of the evaluations are missing. Again, the training program requires that these be filed. Why isn't IT picking up these missing evaluations in their systems? How is it that these people can go on and not have the proper documentation, and then they get qualified and then there's problems? And then the next thing, the last bullet point here, instead of having one dedicated trainer for the conductor trainee for the duration of the training, a number of conductors act as trainers. Again, a huge, huge issue. Now, there may be a benefit to having more than one trainer because let's say one isn't necessarily the best trainer. So maybe there is, some justification to having more than one trainer. But the fact is, if that was a changed aspect of the training program and it was not approved by Transport Canada, that would have been a violation of the Railway Safety Act by CN Rail. So the other thing is the lack of communication among trainers. Okay, so if they're violating the law and they have more than one trainer, they don't even have them communicating one with the other with the next trainer in the field to address shortcomings. It's a total free-for-all, and there's no communication there to ensure that shortcomings are addressed or at least recognized by the next trainer so that they know, hey, don't let this guy walk off in the dark by himself. He's got problems with switching operations and with working independently. So if the other trainer before you doesn't communicate that to the new trainer, again, you can see why people are getting killed. There's huge gaps in proper communication in these training programs and what's allowed and what's not allowed. Now, the last arrow here on this particular sheet that I want to show you, it says an on-the-job trainer is an experienced employee who is designated by the company to provide assignments and trainers for a trainee. Well, that sounds like a manager who's going to provide you your assignment and who's going to be working with you. I got to tell you, I call this a made-to-fit definition by the Transportation Safety Board. This definition is nowhere to be found at Transport Canada or in the rules or regulations or acts. It's nowhere to be found. This is a made-to-fit definition, and you're going to see why it's a made-to-fit definition. The on-the-job trainer, they kind of use two different roles as on-the-job trainer in these accident reports pertaining to the death of Jason Clooney. The real on-the-job trainer is obviously the supervising conductor. He's the one doing the field training. But there's this other thing called the OJT, which is also called an on-the-job trainer. And that person doesn't go along on the qualification trips. And in the case of Jason's accident, the on-the-job trainer as a witness was interviewed over 200 days after Jason's death. And I think that had to do with the fact that we were trying to put together our story du jour in the accident reports and the Transportation Safety Board reports. And so we confused the readers and rail families and taxpayers by discussing really two people. One who's the actual trainer, the supervising conductor, and this other one that has the title of OJT, who really had nothing to do with the training of trainees in the field. So switcheroo, and here made to fit definitions that are nowhere else to be found. But it's a made to fit definition that the Transportation Safety Board came up with in this accident report, and it was signed off on by the then CEO of CN Rail, Claude Mongeau, and the Minister of Transportation, who also had to review this accident report for accuracy in the interest of furthering rail safety in the future. They all signed off on this when they had to know there's a lot of problems with this accident report. So just more things to be aware of as far as how people reading these reports are being brainwashed. And footnotes, I have come to learn, are extremely important when it comes to picking out the lies in these accident reports and figuring out how you're being brainwashed. So just another point to keep in mind. Okay, so if you look here, we have page 12 of the Transportation Safety Board report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And I'm going to read these 3 bullet points for you here. There is no requirement that a trainer be briefed on any potential shortcomings that may have been identified previously regarding a newly assigned trainee. Well, that's because there was only supposed to be one trainer. And so why would you have a requirement that a trainer be briefed on any potential shortcomings identified previously by somebody else? There was only supposed to be one trainer, so it would make no sense to have such a provision given the current training programs that were in place. There was only supposed to be one trainer through the duration of the training program. Now, the second bullet point, conductors, unlike locomotive engineers, are not required to become familiar with the territory before working unsupervised. Well, first of all, a couple of points here. That might be true for a conductor, but not for a conductor trainee. A conductor trainee cannot work alone. And so that would not be a valid statement because they cannot work unsupervised because they're not qualified. So by definition, a conductor trainee has not qualified. So before working alone or unsupervised, you see how they're twisting the sentences to give you the story du jour that they want to give you. A conductor trainee must absolutely work supervised. So that last part of the sentence, it gives them, that's not a false statement according to them. There's no law enforceable in court that says that a conductor, cannot work in unfamiliar territory. But again, is that really the truth? Because if you look here over on the right, this comes from the Canadian Rail Operating Rules. This is version from 2008 and under general rules. Look at point X here, number 10, where the arrow is on the bottom. When reporting for duty, they must be fit. First, you need to read at the top. Every employee. So does not distinguish between a conductor trainee, a locomotive engineer. It just says every employee in any service connected with movements, handling of main track switches, and protection of track work and track units shall, when reporting for duty, be fit, rested, and familiar with their duties and the territory over which they operate. So, every employee in any service connected with movements, that, it does appear to me that according to the Canadian Rail Operating Rules, they must be rested and familiar with their duties and the territory over which they operate. So again, is that point on page 12, point number 2, really true? Here's what's happening. The Canadian Rail Operating Rules, again, are just rules. Are they really enforceable in court? So here's what's happening. We're going to tell you this, but even though that Canadian Rail Operating Rule is out there, well, is that enforceable in court or not? You would think that if it's a Canadian Rail Operating Rule that you must be familiar according to this, point 10 on the general rules under Part A, that you must be familiar with your territory. But wait, that's just a rule. It's not enforceable in court. So do they have to be familiar or not? But again, the way that they worded this sentence with, it's not required for conductors to become familiar with the territory before working unsupervised. Well, a conductor trainee is not a conductor. He's a trainee. They're not qualified. So they must work supervised. And the whole issue of familiarity with the territory is a much smaller issue and a non-issue when the regulation states they're not allowed to work alone in an occupational category unless they've first been qualified in that occupational category. So you can see again how they twist the sentence to give you the story du jour, the story that they want to give you on this particular day. And we will pull and, whatever from whatever rule or proposed new rule that never went into effect, or we'll take from the regulation that we only need to file, any changes within 90 days after implementation. We forget the act and what it says about changes having to be first filed and approved by the Minister of Transportation. So by playing with all the documents in the background, whether or not those are new proposed rules or rules like the Canadian Rail Operating Rules or regulations or act, we can push and pull and make the story that we want to make in these investigation reports. And unless the reader is familiar with all these documents in the background, you would have no idea how much you're being brainwashed by the Transportation Safety Board, Transport Canada, the rail carriers involved. These reports I can guarantee you they're probably written by lawyers. And in my opinion, anybody who played a role in writing of a report like that of conductor trainee Jason Clooney at the Transportation Safety Board, and anybody who signed off on such a report, which is, in my opinion, a complete and total public scam of a report, you know, the allocation of public funds to such a deceptive report, a garbage investigation report, as I call it. Breach of public trust, folks, is a criminal offense. And in my opinion, there's a lot of people who belong in prison over issues like this. Just my opinion. You're free to form your own. Then the last point, the on-the-job trainer or train master does not ride along on trips to evaluate actual trainee performance. Again, they're playing with the title of the on-the-job trainer. Here they call it also or train master. A train master is a manager that works usually in the yard, overseeing the yard operations. The on-the-job trainer that really trains the employee. So they use the term conductor, supervising conductor basically, and on-the-job trainer interchangeably in these reports when they're two different people. The supervising conductor, when Jason was killed, he was interviewed the day after Jason's death. His witness statement was provided. He was the actual on-the-job trainer supervising conductor trainee Jason Clooney that day. Whereas this other on-the-job trainer, or OJT, a second person, was interviewed and his witness statement was taken over 200 days after Jason Clooney was killed. They're two completely different people. But by using the on-the-job trainer title, they can take those two people and they interswitch and intermingle them in the report as though they are one person. And the average person would not be wise to what's going on as far as the switcheroos being played and the intertwining of two people when only one was truly the on-the-job trainer, and that would have been the supervising conductor, not the OJT. Okay, before we go on and move forward here, again, I gave you the general rules for the Canadian Rail operating rules previously as they were on in 2008. This is a copy of the same general rules under the Canadian Rail operating rules. On the left here is the 2020 version, and on the right, you can see I went right to the current Transport Canada website for the Canadian Rail operating rules. Under general rules, you can see the arrows at the top there. And again, under point 10, there's the very same wording. When reporting for duty, be fit, rested, and familiar with their duties and the territory over which they operate. And that version is the Canadian Rail operating rules, and they've got that shown for 2022 through 2023. So again, you can pull whatever document is necessary to create the story that you want to give on that day based on all the documentation in the background. So when you say that, they don't need to be familiar with the territory, is that true if that's part of the Canadian Rail operating rules? So why do we even have this document? Why not just throw the whole thing out if it's not true and it's not a requirement? Why do we have the Canadian Rail operating rules at all? So I guess that would be my argument in court, along with the fact that per information I found, it also seems that the Canadian Rail operating rules may have been implemented and brought into effect illegally. And we're going to get into a whole lot more on that one. And that, again, will have huge implications when it comes to definitions of certain things like what's a yard for yard training and what is a transfer. So if something is a regulation, again, a regulation overrides a rule. And so if the previous regulation, which was replaced supposedly by the Canadian Rail operating rules, was never properly repealed, are the Canadian Rail operating rules even valid? Very good question. That would make a really good debate in courts. So there are so many issues, folks, that I have found. I have poured over documents for years in order to put all of this together in order to help protect my child and every other rail worker out there in both Canada and the US, because CN and CP also had huge rail lines in the US. And I care about US rail workers as much as I do about the Canadian rail workers. Um, I was the daughter of a coroner, and I was raised, families have a right to the truth. So I don't care if you're a rail worker in Canada or in the US, your family has a right to the truth if something happens and you get injured, or worse, you get killed. Okay, so this next section here on page 12 of Jason's accident report shows how he had 6 different trainers when, according to information that seemed to have been filed with Transport Canada, you were supposed to have 1 trainer for the duration of your field training program. But then it says, even though he had 57 road trips, he had not yet completed the yard training practical component. So here's the issue. You know, I knew someone who worked in the same area as conductor trainee Jason Clooney, and this person was a newly qualified conductor in that area. And he said that, again, the conductor trainees around, they pretty well know one another. They went to class together, they were in training together. So other conductor trainees or newly qualified conductors would likely have known or known of conductor trainee Jason Clooney if they worked in that same area. And I was told by this one person who also worked at CN and was newly qualified as a conductor that the word was that Jason was being qualified in the field the day that he was killed. And if that is true, and that's an if that is true, why would he have been having a qualification test in the field if he had 0 yard training? That's a huge issue. My child was qualified with 0 yard training. So I suspect, and my child was a conductor trainee at the same time as Jason Clooney. So the other issue here is 3 of the trainers' road trips for Jason had been to this same location called Murphy's where he was killed. So is that familiarity? In the investigation report, it said that he was working in unfamiliar territory. So had he only been there in the dark? Because this was basically the end of the line for that trip when he was killed and they arrived there in the dark. Had that always been the case? Had he always worked there only in the dark and potentially unsupervised? And there's other issues with that particular work location as far as the labeling of the switches and etc. So was he familiar with this territory or not? And then it says that while the evaluations were generally favorable for Jason, there were 5 comments provided by 2 different trainers. So more than one person had noticed this, that identified that the trainee had difficulty with switching activities and with working on his own, and that he required more work to learn the territory. While some trainers discuss observations and comments with trainees, others do not. So you have at least 2 of the trainers of the 6 that noticed that this guy had troubles with switching activities and with working independently. And yet CN Rail on that day allowed him to walk off in the distance, in the dark, in unfamiliar territory, unsupervised, when they knew at CN Rail that he had problems with working alone and with switching operations. And he ended up flipping a switch the wrong way. He went further down a side track to install a derail, had his back to the movement, and because the switch was flipped the wrong way, the movement came onto him and killed him in the dark. There's a whole lot of other issues as far as the switching and the training that we're going to get into that, in my opinion, absolutely played into the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, but I'll keep those precious nuggets for another video. But just know at least 2 people had identified the fact that this person had trouble with working alone and with switching operations. And that's how he ended up getting killed. He was working alone and he had engaged in switching operations, reversed a switch the wrong way, and there was no supervising conductor there to verify his work. And if he was being qualified that day and doing his qualification field test, as some did seem to believe was happening, and that's an if, but if that was true, how can you properly qualify someone and know that they're doing the right thing if you're not there observing the work as a supervising conductor? Again, another issue, as is the fact that according to the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada and the hearings that happened there, the supervising conductor, who had several years with CN Rail, per a conversation I had with the health and safety officer pertaining to this case, that supervising conductor had a lot of years at CN. And yet, in the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada, it was revealed that CN had not trained him in how to properly supervise a conductor trainee. So if he wasn't trained properly in how to do that, that would mean a whole lot of other supervising conductors were never properly trained in how to supervise a conductor trainee. Okay, so this is going to end part 2 of the brainwashing video, and how easy it is to do when those reading a railway investigation report do not know all the laws that play into such reports, as well as the regulations, the rules, guidelines, policies, whatever. And you also need to understand how the layout of an investigation report also helps with the story du jour or the brainwashing that the Transportation Safety Board and or its rail picks or rail partners in crime want to accomplish. Just the layout of the report by, changing the time stamps or changing where certain times appear in the report, as we saw in the It's Just a Matter of Time video, or how, changing what you discuss. Is it regulations and you completely ignore the act, which would override? Or you make statements with the letter S, making it plural when it should be singular, there should only have been one trainer in the field. There's all kinds of issues, but also, as we're going to see in part 3, more on the issue of layouts and how we separate one discussion from another also helps with the brainwashing and the message that they give you in all these not all these investigation reports, but definitely the one pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, which is, in my example, a classic example when it comes to brainwashing. So learn to question everything. And on that note, I will see you on the next one. Okay, so again, remember, like, share, and subscribe. And if you are subscribed, make sure you have not been unsubscribed, because I'm sure you can see there's a lot of people who would not want this information to get out there. So share it with as many people as you can. And I will see you on the next one, part 3.